A caged thing, even caged for its own good, still has resentments towards being stared at. Kaina thought of Den Mother Marshing in her voyeurism, and she believed this. She had been alone for a while, but now a good number of other vehicles were with her again. Kaina was beginning to feel good again, really nice and mellow. As the radio played her old songs, most of which she hadn't heard in years, she was grooving in her own little space and time. The accident came upon her quickly and without warning. She didn't understand how she had missed the warning signs. She had noticed that the traffic had slowed considerably, and that, for the last few miles, there had been more cars for some reason, and all driving closer to her. She hadn't minded them, and she hadn't really noticed them. She hadn't really allowed her thoughts to be distracted to the point of concern, either. She had, at one point, idly entertained the idea that they might be approaching a city, even though no city was on her map. But that was the only thing that could account for these cars slowing down. Kaina was aware of one thing as they approached the scene of impact. She had missed the warning signs that an experienced driver would have noticed, even on unfamiliar territory as she was. An experienced driver would have smelled this accident long before actually getting here, simply by the traffic and the clues she had missed. Kaina felt shame at her inexperience. She slowed down abruptly. The car was flipped over in the median ahead. The wheels were bent like the car had been stepped on by a gigantic child at play. There was a steady cloud of steam rising from the rust-colored underside, and the exhaust system was ripped loose from the carriage under the back like veins from a varicose surgery. The pipes lay twisted along the ground, and the muffler poked obscenely out of the dirt, its one finger raised defiantly into the air. The top of the car was flat against the ground under the weight, and there was a shimmering sea of green crystallized glass that led to the vehicle from off the highway. There were black marks that had an abrupt, sickly end to them as the car had somersaulted onto the grassy strip of median. Kaina felt her spirit plummet, her mood drop heavily. There was an ambulance, and there were a pair of white-shirted men who had a victim on the ground. They were tying him to a board. Kaina had to force her eyes back on her own 10-mile-an-hour driving as a policeman waved her impatiently through the crowd of rescue vehicles, police cars, and yet another ambulance. Kaina didn't see any more vehicles, but she did see the bits and pieces of what appeared to be the gas tank, mirrors, and handlebar of a motorcycle. The bike was strung out along the highway like the entrails of some partially digested fish, regurgitated by a great white shark onto the road. Kaina saw the implications of such severe mechanical damage, and it made her sick. It hurt her feelings. There was death written all in these metallic remains, and she could not help but notice it. As she cleared the accident and got back up to highway speed, she did so apprehensively. It could have been her back there. Who else was stupid enough to try and come out here and drive on a major highway with an exact 1 block's worth of experience under her belt? That was it for her. 1 whole block of experience in driver's ed class. Just enough to get her license. There ought to be laws that govern such things as that, she thought. There ought to be highway tests before a license is issued. She drove along now towards the town of Madras. Madras would be her turning point to a highway known as 97. From there, she'd be heading to Willowdale, and then on to Ashwood. The radio had kept dropping little suggestions like Traveler's Advisory and Blizzard. Kaina had mentally kept up with the growing storm that was making its way through the Ty Valley area on her map. A fear went through her as she continued on, and for the first time she considered the possibility of using a detour. There was an unnamed road ahead on her map, and it connected Madras with Ashwood directly. But there were no route numbers, just a thin gray line. Most likely it wouldn't have any sign up to show where it was when she got there, but it did connect Ashwood and Madras with a curved rural road. A road that did not have to go on north into the snow-forecasted Willowdale. a road that didn't go through the blizzard-warned Upper Highway 97 at all. She decided that the shortest distance between 2 points was a curved, unnamed road, a line. According to the scale of miles, it was about 20 miles long. She thought, that means I can save all those miles and still be able to avoid the blizzard. Kaina was getting road weary, and she did want to see her mama again and get her tail in a nice hot tub of water. Oh, that would feel so good. She closed her eyes just for a second, and she thought about it. Well, if the road was there, she saw no reason why she shouldn't take it. A perfectly good road. If they went to all the trouble to place it there for her, she'd be stupid not to use it. After all, Mama Kelly wanted her to be efficient as well as innovative, didn't she? Of course she did. Kaina shifted now in her seat, and she crumpled up her empty Dr. Pepper can so that it wouldn't leak out on the carpet. She wanted to get that wonderful feeling Olivia Newton-John was talking about, asking her if she'd ever been mellow. She'd like to get that way right now. The feeling was very intense and it frightened her. She wanted a beer. She had been drinking way too much lately, and now she started to crave beer when she didn't have it. Her little drunken episodes had been becoming more frequent than she cared to admit. She had been getting drunk about once a week since Kelly had left her. It's just because I don't have my mama, she justified. Once I see Mama, I'll be fine. She drove on down the road, humming the song as it lulled her peacefully along the empty highway, now all but deserted once again. Echo walked up the back staircase to Unit C. She had seen her mother was still shopping, and that Den Mother Marshing was out of her office. The big Ford Thunderbird that Den Mother drove was missing from its appointed place. With both of her overlords so occupied, Echo was now free to visit Kaina's apartment without hindrance. It felt naughty and good to break into Kelly's apartment and visit her friend Kaina, even though she wasn't there. The key slid into the lock and turned the bolt away. She pushed the door, and it went into the kitchen, just as if Kaina had been there to open it for her. A feeling of uncontrollable sadness washed over Echo as she stepped into the kitchen. The place still smelled of Kaina. Her Kaina smell permeated all of the remaining furnishings and appliances. Echo couldn't quite place the type of smell that she had associated with her friend and her house, but a nice sort of watery smell would accurately describe it, like after a rain. The place always seemed fresh. Maybe it was the plants in the room that helped it to smell that way, but Kaina's slightly heavy clean smell was apparent. Echo felt her chest tighten as she realized Kaina was gone. Her sadness for the moment caused fresh tears to escape down her face like tiny silver mice. She realized how much she loved her friend and how much she was going to miss her. She walked over first to close all of the drapes. This done, she walked all over the room and down the hallway into the bedrooms. She checked all of the windows to make sure they were locked. Kaina and Kelly had left a lot of expensive things here, and doing this helped to make Echo feel like that she was doing something positive here. Also, it made her feel like that they would be coming back to get these things. At least Kaina would be back. Maybe. Please, God. Echo walked about the various rooms as if she wasn't Echo at all, but an outsider. She went into Kaina's room and saw the freshly made bed, how tight a corner Kaina folded for her spread, and how clean everything was. Echo had to realize that Kaina had not slept in here for weeks, and that was why it was so clean. Echo thought of the little pig Kaina had given her, and she smiled. She had taken it by her house first thing, to sit it where the other one used to be, before she had smashed it. She then picked up all the remaining pieces of her little pig and discreetly dumped them into the kitchen trash can. She walked out of Kaina's neat room and into Kelly's messy one. The first thing she meant to do was make Kelly's bed for her. This would be the good and right thing for her to do. That would cover her later for what she was planning to do. for what she knew she was going to do. She was going to go snooping through Kelly's personal drawers, looking in places that should have been forbidden to her, places that were forbidden to her. That was why she knew she'd have to go through these things. Well, hell, thought Echo. I mean, damn it. My mother won't tell me the rest of what I need to grow up. Maybe I can find out what a real lady has in her bedroom, if Kelly left any of her things. Maybe I can sniff around and explore and learn a little bit about life. She had hoped to find some of Don's things in here, too. A rumor was that he had slept over here some. Men left traces of them everywhere they went. Even an old t-shirt or an unused condom would give her something to at least explore scientifically, like an archaeologist or an anthropologist. She'd feel like David Attenborough, prowling through the secrets of a best friend's mother and her furtive lover, who had illegally come into an apartment complex for women and had left whatever she might find as proof. A smile came across her face as she wondered what was in those drawers, what was in back of Kelly's still partially full closet. That part was going to be great fun. But Echo would not do this today. No, today was a day of mourning, and she was going to be as good as gold in here today, out of respect for Kaina. Even though Echo knew her wicked and lusty little self would eventually go prowling, it would not do so now. There was too much sadness in here today for any positive research. She would wait. She checked her watch and saw that it was only 4:30. Okay, so she had not come directly home from the airport. So she had walked about 5 miles from the park, where she'd met some school friends and they'd played for a while. So what? Who was gonna know? She wasn't gonna be sore or anything. And what if she was? Brenda would never know. If Brenda hadn't seen her walking down the road towards home, she'd have no way of knowing what Echo had done today. Now, Mama would be coming home in about an hour. That would give her time to have a cigarette or two, and then rinse with Kaina's Listerine. Pop in a piece of cinnamon fireball blowgum, which could kill the smell of an week-old elephant on the plains of the Serengeti, and boom, she was set. She smiled, recalling how her favorite blowgum burned like fire with that initial hit. She did enjoy the burning. Now to find that joint Kaina had stashed for her. If my mama finds this, Kaina had whispered to her, I will get whipped. My mother's done told me if she finds any drugs at all, other than the ones I get from her, that's it. I can count on a thrashing, Echo. The ones Kelly had referred to, Echo knew, were legal drugs like beer and Valium. Those drugs Kelly would tolerate. Anything else and she'd blister poor Kaina's bottom. Well, it was certainly no different at Echo's house, except Brenda didn't know how to whip a daughter and then forget about it. No, she liked to smack Echo around for about a half an hour, give her a rash of shit, and then yell at her. Then would come the beating, with all the stinging marks and near misses. Yeesh. Then would come the thing to be broken, a ritual Kaina would never know about. Kaina wasn't abused like Echo was. She could be punished in love, and then it was over till the next time. But not Echo. There was always the thing to be broken ritual. Sometimes the thing to be broken was Echo's possession, and sometimes it was Mama's. It seemed to be dependent upon which room of the house they were in when the shit hit the proverbial fan. Once it had been the vase on the coffee table, the great green one. A neutral item, it was a wedding present from Gregory Bradley for the marriage that would later produce Echo. That hadn't mattered too much. On the other hand, one time it had been Brenda's vanity mirror. Brenda was still bitching about losing that. One other time it had been Echo's favorite record in the whole world. A Walt Disney thing she'd purchased at a filling station. Echo would cry for weeks over losing Jiminy Cricket's rendition of When You Wish Upon a Star. Echo had been playing her record when her mother had jerked the door open to inflict the belt on her. Echo had only been 5 or 6 at the time, yet she recalled her mother wailing the shit out of her for anything, even at that age. It was about 2 years after the divorce with Daddy, and Brenda was about as territorial as she'd ever get. But to whip so young a child and break her record, too, it was an insensitive thing to do. "It was your fault, Echo," Brenda had told her later about the incident. "You fell on it while you were trying to get away from me. You know not to run from me, young lady." Right. Tell a child to willingly submit to a thrashing, particularly one like Brenda Bradley would give. Brenda would always make Echo run from her. It was part of Brenda's sadistic nature, and the broken record punctuated the punishment. Maybe a Kelly whipping could be tearfully endured and then sniffed away, but not one by Brenda Bradley. No, she liked to see a little mortal terror thrown in there for good measure. It was good for the Catholic soul. Echo had seen the Jiminy Cricket record in a store at the mall a few months ago, and she'd cried a little bit even then. At the time, she had been buying Motley Crue's album Shout at the Devil, and she had seen the lovable little cricket over there advertising that old song for children. She wished that childhood was that sweet. As she paid for her heavy metal purchase, she realized that if life was all that sweet and good, maybe kids wouldn't grow up to buy hard rock albums, nor vent their frustrations listening to them. Maybe there would be a lot more Jiminy Cricket albums sold. She swore that one day she was going to buy Jiminy Cricket for her little girl, when she had one, and she'd dare the devil himself to break it, for any reason. A dead man would be the man who broke Echo's next Jiminy Cricket record. Echo took the joint down from Kaina's closet, and she lit it with Kaina's red lighter. She dragged deeply and went over to curl up in Kaina's papasan chair. She held Kaina's abalone shell ashtray under the joint so it wouldn't flick little pinhole burns in the upholstery of the chair. Kaina would be mad if Echo messed up her chair. The joint was stronger than Echo had expected it would be. Echo reached over and flipped on the stereo. Motley Crue was pounding out The Looks That Kill, and she turned it up a little bit. The joint was making her feel terrific. "This is for you, Mama," said Echo, dragging the joint deeper into her tiny lungs. "This is for you, Mama, and Jiminy Cricket." She finished her song and her joint, and then turned the radio off. She sat there in the fading light for a long time, missing her friend badly. A few more moments and a few more tears, and she'd have to go home again. Home to Mother. Home to act as if nothing was wrong. Act as if she hadn't been crying. Act as if Kaina was still up here in this empty, cold apartment. It was not going to be easy. After a while, she stood up in the darkened room and made her way over to the door to lock up and leave for the night. After she made sure her joint was not going to set fire to anything, she decided to make sure. She tossed the butt into the toilet and didn't bother to flush it. Chapter 7. The woman came away from the window. She was wrapped in an old Indian blanket and wearing no other clothes at all. Her bare feet moved silently beneath the swirling ends of the blanket. Her long brown hair was matted from sleep. It lay tangled upon her arms and shoulders like a shawl. It had not been combed in a very long time. She had grown rather used to her own musky smell, her own natural scents. She was even rather fond of the way she smelled, and she wondered why women would want to bathe so much anyway. Bathing, the man had told her, rinsed away a lot of a person's immunities. She believed him. She believed anything he told her. Despite her crude lifestyle, she was beautiful. Her skin reflected the Arapaho Indian background in her blood, and her delicate eyes and lips spoke of the Hungarian royalty which was her heritage. Although she would never know it, there was a well-known line of blue-blood princesses on her family's maternal side. They would all peer out of her each time she saw her reflection in the dusty, cracked mirror which hung beside her solitary bed. She would smile back at them. Occasionally, she would love herself. She would wait until times like now when he was no longer in the house with her. He always went into town frequently for supplies and things, and then she was left alone here in the room. Then she would do it. She would do it partly out of whatever remaining defiance she had for him, and partly because it made her feel good. She would touch her pretty face, looking at herself in the glass, and then she would mentally step out of herself and see herself as another person. She had a man living inside her body, in fantasy, and she would become him whenever she had feelings like these. Then she would make love to the woman in the mirror. She would drop her blanket and stand looking at the nude woman before her. The man did provide her with hand lotion, and at times like these she would cover herself completely in the wonderful lanolin softness. The fireplace heat had a terrible tendency to dry her out. She had to anoint her body with the cocoa butter at times to remain soft and supple. The lotion made her feel good and ladylike. She reveled in her private pleasure. She had Vaseline as well, for he believed in Vaseline for everything. She would grease her pretty little lips daily, kissing them together and tasting her greasy kisses with her tongue. She liked it best with him gone from the room. She had nothing to do but try and comfort herself, since that was what she needed most of all. She had become her own mother, best friend, and lover, all in the same little brown woman. It was a wonderful arrangement, despite her life with him. There was no other way she could make it any more bearable. She had to admit that his presence in her life was very positive. Before, she had been taking crack cocaine, and had been living a basically captive life to that drug. Before coming here, she had lived with a man who liked to beat women, or else she had been living with Mary Ann McClure. That had been an experience. Mary Ann was a nympho bull who enjoyed the most bizarre rituals. She had a religion of leather that could be described quite accurately as fundamentalist cowhide. Nothing that she had ever known before this man, though, was really worth the trouble to pine away for. She had not been happy before meeting him, and now she had a lot of time to think back on just how miserable she really had been. She didn't know if it made her happier in her present state or not. All she knew was that now she had a chance to sit down and reflect on her life, from the past to the present. Before, she had always been too busy to ponder anything in her life. She was just a flurry of irrelevant activity before, and now she had the time, as the old saying went, to wipe herself. She had plenty of time for that now. He had slowed her way, way down. It wasn't all that unpleasant, either, to be calm for a change. It was like being forced to live with nuns or something. Something like that. When he was away, like now, she could have all the time in the world to get to know her true self. She didn't have to get all made up and please a lot of people. She didn't have to be anything but herself. And she did discover that, yes, she was naturally lazy. She could lay around all day if she wanted to, and there was no one to stop her. Of course, now, being lazy was mandatory. There was nothing else at all for her to do. He did intrigue her. This had bothered her at first. His caveman mentality, so repulsive to the women she'd known in New York, had actually fascinated her. She knew that, deep inside all women, there lay a streak of masochism that demanded anyone who had the strength and the nerve to come and take her deep and hard. Make it hurt a little bit. Make it good. Women liked being roughed up just a little bit from time to time. It made things like childbearing so much easier. She had been having rape fantasies of all sorts since the time she was 11 years old, and she loved the thoughts of being made to appear vulnerable and weak. She loved being made to perform for an irresistible force. Her man, though repulsive to her as a human being, made her happy when she thought of him as a wild animal with an IQ of 0. That made her very happy. He wouldn't be back for a while, she knew. Tomorrow he might come back, and maybe not. He'd left her food, and so for a few hours, maybe even a few days, she could have some time to herself. She wanted to try and relax as much as she could while he was gone, for she couldn't really relax around him, even after all this time. If he would just take her by force and make her love him, then she might, in time, succumb. But he had shown her several times that it was exciting to him to force her affection, and that turned her off again. She'd get really snotty at him during times when he would show her his pleasure at how she was progressing, and then he'd smack her around some more until she felt better towards him. "You can make me love you," she smiled to herself, thinking of him. "You can make me love you, but you can't enjoy it. If you do, I get turned off." Perhaps it was her built-in safety net that made her that way. Perhaps it was nature's way of a barrier to the unnatural love he sought from her. Either way, she was grateful for it, for if the man was nothing else in this world, he was handsome. Sleep was her real savior. In sleep she could step out for a few minutes and be away from the place. She never dreamed of this place, and for that she was grateful. In fact, since she had come to live here, she had not had a single nightmare at all. All of her nightmares occurred while she was awake, these days. She stretched out on her bed, and she fixed her eyes against the ceiling. A watermark figure of a stain near the corner reminded her of an elephant, and she loved elephants. She smiled up at her favorite stain, and she felt herself beginning to fade away. It was just too peaceful out here to stay awake for very long. After a while, sleep descended soundlessly upon her like a warm gray sheet. There was nothing either in the room nor outside of it to make any sound whatsoever to disturb her. Kaina had just driven through Madras when she became frightened. It had been snowing for a long time in that little town, and it was sticking. The roads were all white, with an inch or so of fine, powdery flakes. Car tracks still pressed through the blacktop, and the downtown area of Madras had looked like the trolley tracks in San Francisco. Out here, however, these were not trolley tracks. Kaina had taken the nameless road to Ashwood. Maybe it wasn't the wisest course she could have taken. She should have gone back to Madras and looked for a hotel somewhere. She should have called her mother to come after her. She should have stayed where there were people and warmth, with a blizzard coming right for them. Her two choices had been simple. She could have taken 97 North, right into the path of the blizzard, or she could take this side road and neatly avoid it altogether. This road was not even named on her map, and there was no sign up to indicate which charming country lane they thought this to be. However, with the storm now coming through Willowdale, it would be in Ashwood within the hour. It was a bad storm, according to the National Weather Service, and it was expected to lay down about 3 feet of snow at least. If she diddled in Madras, running up a motel bill for Don to have to pick up, she might be days before she could see her mother again. She had terrible visions of having to stay in some rat-hole motel where every traveling Oregon tourist since Lewis and Clark had bedded down for the night. She had a morbid dread of sleeping on pillowcases with the head hairs of strangers tickling her nose at night, their nasty old sheets that they had done their private business upon touching against her nice, pure, virginal body. Yuck. She didn't want to sleep in any strange beds except the one that Kelly had spent the morning making for her out in Ashwood somewhere. She didn't want to have to deal with rude, lusty Oregonians who would think that she was cute, stupid, and virginal. Which she was. Screw that, she thought. I'm going to damn sure try to make it before the big one blows through here and strands us all together. The way up 97 was now closed. The man had just announced that traffic northbound from Madras was being turned away 10 miles from the city limits. She snickered to herself and smiled deviously. Police officers were directing them away from the town of Willowdale because of traffic conditions. Cops were always doing things before it was necessary. It's not that deep yet up there. It can't be. They just do things early like that to piss people off with their authority. She looked at the white landscape before her. There were no cops out here to say anything to her. She'd make it to Ashwood with plenty of time to spare. The little gray rural route, according to her map, was only about 20 miles long. That way Willowdale had to be 30 or more. She'd be earlier than expected if she didn't get stuck or something awful like that. Don't be silly, Kaina. Grow up, she said. You'll make it. Echo would have tried it if she was this far along. Kelly would have tried it just to see if it could be done. Quit being such a baby. Wait till you get to see your mama again and tell her about how hard you tried to get there. She'll let you get up on her lap by the fire maybe and get warm. The pleasure of that thought struck her deeply. Just like a long time ago. Remember, Kaina? Remember how it was? It had been in Florida years ago that Kaina had one of her sweetest and most enduring remembrances of her mother. It had been just the two of them while Jane was off courting her future husband. Grandmother never got in the way of their daughter and granddaughter relationship. She would not dream of doing such a thing, like the way Mrs. Cherbourg was always thinking of others before herself. Kaina had always believed that Grandmother Jane had gotten remarried just so Kelly and Kaina could be together, to become best of friends, like they had eventually become. Had it not been for Grandmother Jane's unselfishness to remarry, Kelly and Kaina would not have bonded as closely as they did. Kaina would not have had those wonderful and powerful memories to see her through these difficult times in her life. Her car was holding the road beautifully. The snow fell into the Frostian woods all around her. It was a beautiful drive, and the black cloud in her rearview mirror seemed almost to belong there. That cloud was the blizzard. Kaina knew that the cloud was the blizzard, or should have been if it wasn't. She knew how much snow it contained. Still, she felt way ahead of it, and she knew she would be by the fire long before it got to her. The memory of their Florida trip came sweeping warmly through her mind as the delicate flick on the dashboard temperature level brought warmth from the engine into her car. She needed just a little heat now, because the cold from outside was at last permeating the metal body of the car. Temperatures were beginning to drop, due as much to the setting sun as the falling snow. Kaina knew from living in Ohio that when it snowed, there was this sudden downdraft of warm air that had the effect of freezing crystals high up in the sky. Or something like that. At any rate, snow didn't exactly mean it was going to be terribly cold out. There was an old saying around Canton she had heard most of her life. It said that some days it got too cold to snow. This was hard to believe, but it was a true statement. She had seen days when she and Echo would wait for the bus, and it would get so cold that they'd have to go to Echo's house to get warm, and watch for the bus from there. They'd see it and take off running to catch it. Those were days that it wasn't snowing. The days that it was too cold to snow. But on days that it did snow and they canceled school, Kaina could still go down to the gazebo to get their newspaper, wearing only a sweatshirt. The air, she recalled, would still be warm, even in the snow. A nice day out, just pouring the snow down. But let the temperatures drop, and the snow stopped. Strange, but true. The dark storm cloud reminded Kaina of an arcane roll cloud, a type of thunder cloud found in Florida. These looked like long rolls of fencing wire, and they usually were seen way in the distance from the beach, either out at sea or sometimes over dry land near the Halifax River. The white snow reminded her of the white sands along the beach in Ponce Inlet, Florida. The snow crystals were blowing dryly across her windshield, and she put on her wipers to clear them away. Just like the sand used to do. Sand would blow like that all across the windows and leave little wispy traces of their presence. Only down there they had to press the washer to clear the sand away. With this snow, all she had to do was wipe. They had vacationed in Ponce Inlet only once, Kaina recalled. Both she and her mom had always wanted to go back again, but after Kaina had grown bigger, there seemed to be little money left for anything but survival. Kaina was like Kelly, having to support another fully grown woman, even as a child. She always liked to eat, and she always outgrew her clothes before the end of the school year. Thinking back on that now, it was a wonder that Kelly could have loved her at all, being such a dead expense as she had been. Kelly really must have loved her daughter a lot. But Kelly had always loved her daughter way too much. Kaina smiled, very glad of that fact. It had rained every day at 2 in the afternoon, Kaina recalled, of their trip to the beach. They would get up early and head for the beach until those big thunder clouds would move in and take over. Kaina was secretly glad that it did rain every day, for she always loved to stay outside until she got sunburned. Kelly didn't have much sun sense either, but those storms in the afternoon made them bring their brown bodies inside before they got all red and hurting. It was as if the beach itself knew when they'd had enough sun. These storms provided something else that Kaina loved and thought about for years afterwards, the quiet time she and her mother would share together. After a morning of Kaina romping up and down the beach, stuffed into her tiny little aquamarine one-piece bathing suit, Kaina would see the great cumulonimbus clouds rising over the land and coming towards the beach to block out the midday sun, to drive everyone off the sand. Before the storm would hit, Kaina and her mother, lying in a lounge chair by the water's edge, would see the little pinpricks of lightning dancing off the distant water of the ocean. Kaina had always thought that was beautiful. They would gather up all of their belongings and head for the little white motel that sat high upon the sand dune. It was a pretty little place, all to itself, along the vast and splayed foliage of the coast. One little white motel amidst all of the green, wild plant life whose leaves had points and whose gnarled brown bodies made Kaina think of deserted islands in the South Pacific. Once upon the reddish sidewalk, they would pass a gazebo with its green plastic roof and thermometer hanging where everyone could see just how hot it did get in the shade in Florida. Kaina loved the gazebo too, and spent many after-dinner hours out back there talking to her friend, the man who owned the place. She tried to think of the name of the motel, but it wasn't coming to her as easily as she would have liked. But best of all would be just before that storm would hit, and Kaina and her mother would get up on the bed nearest the wall and kick their sandy feet off and into the bed and lay together to wait for the storm to blow over. They shared no closer times than these, waiting for the storms to blow over the ocean. Kelly was a little bit afraid of storms, and she'd hug Kaina up so close to her for comfort. Kaina would nestle down against her mother's breast, comforted and safe from any storm. She had the rich, warm love of Kelly Erbickham, and she needed for nothing else. Kaina felt as if she was actually still there, in room 5, on that green spread beside her mother's warm body. What little only child could want any more than that? Kaina had never in her life missed the fact that she had no father. Her mom always gave her more love than she needed. There had been that rich smell of cocoa butter that they'd worn as they lay together, both of them brown as berries. That was Kelly's favorite saying for someone with a tan. She would always say that they were as brown as a berry. It made Kaina smile to remember her mother's little saying. Being brown like that and smelling of cocoa butter made Kaina very happy. She had always thought that she and her mother were two very handsome women, comely and attractive to most people, especially together. Together they could complement each other very well, and when they both had deep dark tans, like they had had that year in Ponce Inlet, then they were downright gorgeous. Their golden dark skin contrasted with their aquiline, Aryan blonde features to make them irresistible. At least, that's what Kaina had thought. Maybe she was prejudiced, but she liked the way she and her mother looked. Kaina remembered how good they had felt together as well. She would always think back to the times they had been together on that bed in room 5, their brown bodies smelling of salt and of each other. Just a pretty woman and her cute little daughter, finding comfort in a comfortless world, finding warmth in a cold tropical storm, finding love as innocent and natural as anything had ever been. It had been very beautiful, and Kaina had been happiest then, before she had grown up and had all these sexual feelings and frustrations. Growing up was, to Kaina Shea Erbacum, a curse, as much of a curse as menstruation. She almost hated being sexual. She felt it made her mean and bitchy. Lust was most distasteful to Kaina, and she hated wanting sex all the time. She was worse off during her period, when she'd get that unprovoked itch that would drive her to distraction. She felt like a lust addict until she could satisfy it somehow or other. Whereas Echo might capitalize on such sensations, knowing her, Kaina just tried to get them to pass on as quickly as she could. She enjoyed those feelings once she got into them, but she hated having them all the time. It was such an inconvenience to have to do anything. Kaina drove on through the powdery white roadway, thinking of a certain painting that used to hang in that room 5, that ocean front room. Maybe it wasn't a painting at all, but a type of silk screen. She couldn't recall now, but she knew that she had thought a lot of that picture. It was a picture of 9 sandpipers all running the same direction, down near the water's edge. There was only white and tan in the color scheme, but these two colors had been used to great contrasted advantage, to show sunlight dappling strongly off the water's edge. Indeed, it was a great work of art. The whole picture appeared to give the illusion that one would have to squint to look at this scene, were it real. The white and tan had been used together beautifully, but the genius was in the way the birds had been partially painted, as though they could not quite be clearly seen in the intense sunlight. White paint on the partial sandpipers made the scene look incredibly real, especially if Kaina squinted at it long enough. She realized now that she was crying. She did not know why. All she knew was a terrific sadness was coming over her, an inexplicable sadness for lost things and things that are no more. She knew in her heart that it could only mean one thing. Kaina didn't like to admit it to herself, but she was a little bit psychic. She hated it like she hated her natural horniness. She wasn't a lustful, lascivious person, and she shouldn't have such high sex drives. This psychic ability affected her the same way. She was not the least bit interested in paranormal phenomenon, and to know something in advance, like this, was not something she had ever enjoyed. She would know things before they would happen. It was sort of like precognition. In the flash that had just occurred to her, she saw the Sea Cove Motel in rubble. Next to it stood a condominium, and on the other side of that, an abandoned house that had not been there before. Neither of these buildings had been there before. It did not look like the same place anymore in her vision. Only the outline of the floor plan, done in marble tile, still remained as it had been. The walls of each individual room were still traced out in raised cinder block patterns flat against the ground. The perfect outline of what had still been remained, but aside from the few remaining white bricks flecked with green underpaint, there was nothing left of the Sea Cove Motel at all. There was a sign there she did not recognize. It bore a legend that said Fisherman's Sea Cove for some reason. The sign had not been there when she had stayed there years ago. The sign was not the nice large white one that Bill and Jean had across the road, nor above the carefully maintained flower bed out front. The sign hinted to her that another, less careful innkeeper had taken over just before the demise of her favorite motel. All of this she saw in her vision. She felt a piercing pain in her head, the price she always paid for peering into that mental crystal ball, for straining her eyes into things she couldn't have possibly been seeing. It wasn't natural, but Kaina's intense curiosity dreamed this stuff up for her to try and strain to see, and she always strained until she got a headache. After that she would stop for a while, and the headache would go away. Now would come her denial. She would say to herself that there was not one shred of proof to the vision she'd just seen. She would deny it for as long as she could, until her mind and her head would tell her otherwise. Only then would she accept the truth of what she had seen. Only after her faith in her own abilities would sink in and tell her. The Sea Cove was gone. She would have to accept this truth, as painful as it was to her. Maybe it wasn't just psychic phenomenon at all. Maybe it's just that I have seen these MTV things until I realize that the little place all to itself must certainly be condominiumed over by this time. Ponce Inlet was too close to Daytona to remain virginal forever. Someone was sure to come along and develop it and destroy it before too many years. Maybe what I saw in my mind was really just what I should have seen that had to happen. Maybe I could visualize what might have happened to the Sea Cove. That was the problem with being psychic. No one would believe, even if it could be proven. So why bother with it at all? Kaina recalled her 10th grade teacher and how she had taught the class about the legend of virgins. Virgins were supposed to be able to prophesy and divine a truth by virtue of the fact that they had never had sex before. The whole class had erupted in gales of laughter and finger-pointing, Kaina recalled. Mrs. Moore had told her class that a vampire was supposed to be unable to hide in a grave without being detected if a virgin boy, naked, rode an unmarked pony across the grave. If the horse crossed the grave, there was no vampire. It sounded like malarkey, and Kaina felt like a load of malarkey as she drove on now, fearful of having discovered the truth behind the Sea Cove through her own virginal visions. Why couldn't she be normal? Kaina, like a number of other gifted psychic people, suppressed her gift of prophecy as best as she could, choosing rather to ignore such things in favor of feeling normal. Fisherman's Sea Cove, indeed. What a stupid name that would be for something. The snow was getting terribly deep. Kaina had not understood how it had gotten so deep on her so fast. She was now plowing literally through it. The car was doing a terrific job of moving her through the stuff, but she knew that she would just make it to Ashwood before it got too deep to carry her on any further. She placed an accurate measurement of its depth at just under 6 inches. It was falling now as thick as a pillow fight. She realized why it was getting so deep after she thought about it for a moment. Oh no. Of course, it had to be. It had been snowing here before she had gotten here. She wasn't actually running away from the snow at all. She was running away from the blizzard storm cloud. Not the snow. The snow had already been here a while. She was running from the object of discussion on the radio, maybe, but she was not running away from the snow itself. She was driving into a separate snowstorm, all its own. She had no idea how deep this was going to get as she approached Ashwood. She might be 3 feet deep right now at the city limits. Well, she would soon find that out. Fear clutched at her heart, and it was an icy grip. She bitterly blamed the radio announcer for not telling her it was already snowing. Damn him. Stupid man. It was his job to know these things. People had a tendency to depend upon the fatherly advice of the media people, and they were supposed to know these things. They were supposed to let other people know. She bitterly beat herself mentally with Kelly's stinging leather tongue. She should have known better than to risk her limited driving prowess with such a stupid thing as not phoning her mother and asking her what it was like up ahead. That would have been the adult thing to have done, not just blindly driving on, like some mama-sick little girl. But you want it your way, don't you, little missy? Yes, ma'am, she answered back silently. You couldn't have given your poor old mother a call back in Madras now, could you, little lady? That would have been asking too much. Now your poor old mother will have to worry herself sick when you finally get stuck out here in the middle of Bufu, Oregon, with no one in sight for miles. You'll freeze to death out here, Kayana. She hated herself for a moment. She wished now that she could rent a room in Madras and just sleep in a whole bed full of pubic hairs. At least she could get up and shower if it got too disgusting. She looked down at her gas dial. It read half a tank. If she got stuck out here, how long would her car stay running and heating before the gas ran out? Was she at risk of carbon monoxide poisoning if she slept in a car with the engine running all night? Would she have to crack a window and risk snow blowing in on her slowly freezing body? She shivered, wishing she had her big winter coat out of her bag and around her shoulders now. Her shirt was wet from her perspiring, and the smell of her sweat, while clean and womanly, was heavy and musky all the same. The stickiness of herself was making her uncomfortable. She contemplated turning back, and saw that she only had 7 more miles to go before she reached what should be the city limits of Ashwood. In high school, Kayana had run track, and on a warm autumn evening after school, she could run nearly 7 miles without stopping. She knew it was a long way, and she knew that she could count on pneumonia, at the very least, from her walk through the snow in sneakers, but she thought she might make it. She would have to make it. She thought of her warm brown mother again at the Sea Cove Motel, and she felt badly about ever leaving Kelly, even for a moment. Her tears were mucus thick. She left you, pumpkin, she told herself. You're just trying to get back to her now. You weren't to blame for this. Kelly's the one to blame. Blame her, Kayana. Kayana nodded that this was the truth, but she also knew that, in her eyes, Mama Kelly could do no wrong. Mama was always right, and it was little stupid, naive Kayana who was always screwing up. Echo had a word for her, and to think of it now made Kayana wince. I love you to pieces, Kayana, said her smart-mouthed friend in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to get it right, she still had a way of screwing up everything around her. Everything Kayana touched turned to crap, right in her very hand. Oh, why did I try this? She demanded of herself. Why? Soon her underside would start to shear off the snow that fell between her tires in her unseen tracks. Soon that shearing would build up enough to stop her car altogether. The depth of the snow would not permit her to move on. Kaina bit her lip and drew blood. She was still going at about 15 miles an hour, and she still had traction, but she was feeling the car begin to slide a little bit with each turn she came to. She was slipping in her traction every so often. The unsteady foot she was using on the accelerator made the tires spin frequently, scaring her even more. The ditch on either side of her car loomed like the guttering along a bowling lane. She was struggling to find the perfect way to drive, to keep herself in motion. The road seemed to be getting slicker. The snow was beginning to freeze. It would be a solid sheet of ice before nightfall, she feared, slick as a cat's meow, even to walk upon. She set her jaw and plowed on through the snow, unaware of what horrible and menacing thing there was for her to encounter near the snow-covered road ahead. In the days that would follow Kaina's departure from Canton, Ohio, and the Princess Arms apartment complex, Echo would finally become a woman. The fact that these bodily changes would overcome her with her older best friend gone would only serve to make Echo feel very badly. Kaina would have known about these feelings, and how simple it would have been for Echo if she could have taken Kaina by her warm little hand and led her off to the bedroom for a quick little sex talk. How easy Kaina would have said something like, "Oh my goodness, Echo, are you having that? It's perfectly natural and blah blah blah." But no. Things were never that simple. All Echo had was her hateful bitch of a mother. Echo would have even confided in Kelly if she had been there, because Kaina surely must have done this or survived that at one time or another. Surely she'd had similar feelings. Surely she must have had similar secretions. Menstruation was known to Echo, of course, but this white, clear stuff was a different matter altogether. What in the name of hell was it? Had she caused it herself with some sort of touching? Was she guilty of hurting herself somehow? Her mother would never forgive her for causing such a discharge as this. Only little boys had white semen, she knew. Only they wet themselves when they had a wet dream. None of the school films ever showed a girl having a wet dream. Girls didn't have such things. Did they? She was tempted to ask Mrs. Cherbourg. She had an ache in her stomach from this worry, a worry also from having no one answer my questions, she thought. I'm a woman, damn it. I've already had sex, and I'm supposed to know everything. Right? Echo Bradley had never experienced orgasm before, but she would during the time that Kaina was away, and it would scare her to death. She would believe that she had some nervous disorder that had caused her body to spasm wildly. And besides her fears of masturbation, vaginal lubrications, and the violent, intense orgasms she could give herself effortlessly, there was one other thing that worried her even worse than any of her biological problems and developments. Echo Joy Bradley was in love. She was deeply in love, and it was scaring the mortal hell right out of her. It's not right, she told herself. It's not right. You're supposed to love a man. You like boys. At least you did before you started playing with yourself like you do. Before you ever did that, you like boys. You've made yourself queer, Echo, by playing with yourself. It did make sense to Echo. She had always liked boys, and she'd never even had a crush before in her life. It was just plain old lust she'd feel for the cute guys in her class, the same ones who would always be staring at her bulky menstrual pads. She never even felt love before, but she was feeling it now. It felt warm and good and sweet and painfully deep. she would have to confide in Mrs. Cherbourg. There was no one else. Her mother would whip her if she told her about what all she did in her bed at night. She couldn't have this kind of emotional pressure within her tiny body unless she had somehow sinned against the Catholics. This was God, all right, punishing her shameful body with his vengeance. Brenda would gladly do it for her in real life. Nope, she had to tell Mrs. Cherbourg. Oh Lord, thought Echo, if I give Mrs. Cherbourg a heart attack with all my wild thoughts and problems, I'll never forgive myself. Echo climbed the stairs to Mrs. Cherbourg's apartment, feeling trepidation. She reached out her small trembling hand and knocked lightly on the old lady's door. She waited, feeling her stomach tie itself in knots. The door opened slowly. "Well, hello, Echo," said Mrs. Cherbourg. "Won't you come in?" Echo smiled genuinely and walked inside the room. The smell of gingerbread became apparent as she entered the kitchen area. The young 14-year-old woman, dressed in her denim and frayed patch jacket, stood beside the octogenarian as if she was a young girl who had been forced to go see Grandma today. A Norman Rockwell snapshot of the scene would have been interpreted like this, but it would have been all wrong. Echo wanted to be here, and Mrs. Cherbourg was not in the least bit concerned about how little Echo dressed herself. Mrs. Cherbourg, using her deductive reasoning, gained from years of seeing and hearing and living, knew Echo wanted something. "I've made some herb tea," said Mrs. Cherbourg, "and I thought you might be by today, so I made some brownies and gingerbread for you." This pierced Echo harshly. She had not thought of coming to see Mrs. T for a social visit. Guilt bashed at her little mind like nails in a board. "But I see," said Mrs. Cherbourg, "you didn't come here for gingerbread, did you?" She touched Echo's hair lightly, and Echo hugged her hard, forgetting that Mrs. Cherbourg had just come from the hospital. "Why don't you make yourself comfortable," said Mrs. Cherbourg, "and I'll get us some tea." Echo nodded, grateful for such a wonderful friend. Mrs. Cherbourg returned moments later with the tea. It would never occur to Echo to think how fast that tea had been made, nor how Mrs. Cherbourg had the ability to start early this morning and make tea and crumpets before Echo was to arrive. When Mrs. Cherbourg wasn't expecting to see Echo at all, it was one of Mrs. Cherbourg's talents, being able to know when someone was going to need something. It was time for a heart-to-heart talk with Deanna Cherbourg. Mrs. Cherbourg smiled a little at her own beautiful timing, but allowed herself no more than that. She was good, and she knew it. She settled down like Angela Lansbury and sipped the rich amber liquid from her expensive teacup. "You knew," said Echo, her eyes slitting, "that Kayina is not here any more, didn't you?" Mrs. Cherbourg nodded. "I knew you knew," said Echo. "Don't ask me how, but I figured you did." "Kayina told me," said Mrs. Cherbourg, causing Echo's eyes to fly open. "She did?" "Yes," said Mrs. Cherbourg. "You know all about Oregon?" asked Echo, hoping she didn't. "She did." "I see," said Echo. "I also know, Echo, that you've been visiting Kayina lately. In fact, I think that's why you're here to see me, isn't it?" Echo's eyes became steel gray marbles in her head, cold and glassy. "Let me help you, asked Mrs. Cherbourg. "You have a personal question, about your body maybe, or about another thing you want to discuss? Why in the name of God wasn't her mother this good? Why couldn't Brenda be as sweet and direct as this lovely old lady?" Echo suddenly felt totally at ease with Mrs. Cherbourg. Suddenly it all sounded so decent when Mrs. T spoke of it, like it was all natural and good. Not like there was the angel of death outside the door, waiting to drag her lusty little self to hell. Echo nodded emphatically, and Mrs. Cherbourg smiled. "I see," she said. "Well, I tell you what, Echo, let me start, and then you may feel free to stop and question me about the particulars as we go." Echo nodded. "You see," said Mrs. Cherbourg, "I too was once a scared, frightened little 14-year-old girl myself." Let me see if it has changed at all, Echo, in the 66 years since I came that way. Echo smiled, and tears of relief ran down her trembling face. I can make this brief, said Mrs. Cherbourg, and painless. You are becoming a woman, Echo. You are having feelings that you don't understand. You want to relieve those feelings, and you might have even started doing so. Do you understand so far, Echo? Echo nodded. She understood. You understand what I mean by touching yourself, then. You know what that's all about. Echo had one question about it, whether or not it was all right, and how much she could do it. Mrs. Cherbourg was quick to say that it was fine to do it, and there was no limit, and that as much as any little girl wanted to have it, it was perfectly normal. Echo slumped, lifelessly grateful, against her chair. You cannot harm yourself in any way, said Mrs. Cherbourg, reaching under her couch for a small bag. It was a paper bag, and in it was a small book. Echo accepted the book as if it had been one of the 10 Commandments. She smiled, and a flash of humor came into her eyes as she read the title of the book. The title read, What Every Mother Ought to Be Telling Her Daughter. Echo had never heard of the book before, but she got up and sweetly kissed Mrs. Cherbourg's cheek. This took Mrs. T. totally by surprise, and she delighted in the nice, spontaneous gratitude Echo showed her. Thank you, child, said Mrs. Cherbourg, as tears came into her eyes. I was afraid I'd hurt myself, said Echo. I had all this white stuff coming out of me, and I didn't know. But you helped me a lot. Thank you. Mrs. Cherbourg looked at Echo and smiled. There is, I believe, one other thing on your mind, Echo. Isn't there? Echo nodded. Caught, of course. Mrs. Cherbourg really did know everything. Echo looked guiltily at her, as if she was about to betray her confidence with this terrifying news, this awfully wicked, perverted news. And, ventured Mrs. Cherbourg, it involves Caina, doesn't it? Echo's eyes grew terribly wide. She suspected Mrs. Cherbourg might be a witch, to know so much. No, I'm not a wizard, said Mrs. Cherbourg. I am an old lady who knows her young friends very well. But when a young girl loses her close friend, as you have, it takes about 3 days for the full impact to hit her. Tell me, Echo, what are the strange and terrible feelings you have been having since Caina left? Echo could not speak. She tried, but she could only clear her throat. Are you afraid of dying, Echo? Are you afraid that you might inadvertently hurt someone? No, ma'am, nothing like that. Mrs. Cherbourg nodded, and timed her replies so that Echo could get ready to answer when she hit the right one. Mrs. Cherbourg instinctively knew which was the right one, but she tactfully buried it in her awesome list of possibilities, just so it would make Echo's problem seem less of a sin to her. Mrs. Cherbourg knew what Echo was fighting now, and she knew it was not her fault, nor a sin of any kind. Well, let me see, said Mrs. Cherbourg. Are you afraid you'll lose your mother, or a close friend, even me? Echo nodded that she'd been concerned for Mrs. Cherbourg, and Mrs. T. understood the nod. Then, said Mrs. Cherbourg, if you're not afraid of getting hurt, nor hurting yourself, nor anyone else, and if you're not afraid of dying, then the only thing I can see that Caina's leaving might have done to you is that you miss her terribly and you want her back again. Echo was crying now, for Caina. It was true. But it's worse than that, she blubbered to the old lady. Mrs. Cherbourg, have you ever been in love before with a woman? Mrs. Cherbourg smiled compassionately. Oh, yes, she whispered. Oh, my goodness, yes. Echo's surprise emanated through the tears, and she made a funny sound in her throat. You have? Of course, said Mrs. Cherbourg. All women fall in love with other women, at one time or another. But that's sick, isn't it? Does it feel sick, Echo? Echo nodded that it did, and she wiped her eyes with her hand. Mrs. Cherbourg handed Echo her embroidered handkerchief, totally cleaned and laundered, as if no tears but Echo's had ever been upon the gentle linen before. Echo accepted it, and a light whiff of lilac caught her under the nose and sweetened her tears as she wiped her eyes.